Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Hercule Poirot and Whispers in the Water. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Man and the Letter. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when Hercule Poirot and his close friend, Captain Hastings, settled into a quiet corner of the quaint Parisian café, Le Jardin des Délices. The steam from their freshly poured tea rose in gentle spirals, blending with the soft, ambient murmur of the café's patrons. Outside, the golden-hued leaves swirled on the cobblestone streets, painting the city with shades of amber and russet. The ambience was peaceful, a brief respite from the bustling world outside, but little did they know that this afternoon would soon be disrupted by an unexpected encounter. Captain Hastings took a sip of his tea, his eyes twinkling with admiration as he observed his old friend. "Poirot, I must say, you're unlike any detective I've ever known. In fact, I dare say you have no equal." Poirot, with his usual composed demeanor, smiled modestly, adjusting his perfectly folded napkin on his lap. "You flatter me, mon ami. But it is only the work of my little grey cells that brings me success." Hastings, always quick to admire Poirot's humility, continued, "And you know, it's not just your skills as a detective that make you extraordinary. It's also your kindness. You refuse to take fees from the poor, and you go out of your way to avoid the cases of the wealthy. It's something I have never understood." Poirot gave a small, thoughtful nod. "The poor, they suffer enough. Their cases, they are often desperate, and their pain is real. To help them, without asking for a reward, it feels right. But the rich, they seek only to further their own interests. Their cases rarely stir my sense of justice. I prefer to remain distant from them." As Poirot spoke, a man sitting at a table nearby was listening intently. He had been observing them for some time, his gaze flicking between Poirot and Hastings. There was something unsettling about the man, his stiff posture, his alertness, as if every word spoken in the café was somehow of great importance to him. Finally, the man stood up, adjusting his coat, and made his way over to Poirot's table. He was a man of medium height, dressed in an expensive, yet somewhat outdated suit, and his face was pale, with a sharpness to his features that suggested he was no stranger to tension or anxiety. When he reached the table, he looked down at Poirot with an intense, almost challenging gaze. "Excuse me," the man said in a deep voice, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. You say you're a good detective, a man of great insight. Well, I'm curious. If you're as good as they say, tell me something about myself." Poirot, who had been sipping his tea, paused for a moment, studying the man carefully. His gaze was calm, his mind already turning the wheels of deduction. He looked the stranger up and down, taking in every detail, the stiffness of his posture, the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped a walking stick, and the way his eyes darted around the room, as though constantly on guard. "You wish me to tell you something about yourself?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but penetrating. "Very well, let me begin by asking you a question. Are you afraid of something, monsieur? That is why you carry that stick with you, yes." The man stiffened, his grip tightening on the stick. For a brief moment, he appeared as though he might refuse to respond. But then, to Poirot's surprise, he nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "You are right," the man admitted, his voice low. "Once, I was attacked by a dog. It left me with a fear that I have never been able to shake. I keep this stick with me to ward off the fear of being attacked again." Poirot nodded as though this was exactly what he had expected. He could tell from the man's body language that the fear was real, even if the reason for it was long buried in the past. "Interesting," Poirot mused. "But there is more to you, I suspect. May I ask, have you ever participated in boxing?" The man's eyes widened, and he looked at Poirot as though he had just revealed a secret that he had hoped would never be discovered. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice tinged with both surprise and wariness. Poirot's gaze never left the man. "Your nose," he said simply. "It is slightly crooked, as if it has been broken at some point. And your ears," he added, "they are not as they should be. They have been stretched, possibly from the force of punches." The man's face turned pale, and for a brief moment it seemed as though he might flee the table. But instead, he took a deep breath and leaned closer to Poirot, his voice trembling slightly. "You are right again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was once a boxer. I fought in many matches. But it was a brutal sport, and it left me scarred, physically and mentally." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained calm. "I see. And there is one more thing. You despise a certain word. A word that begins with the letter J." The man recoiled, his eyes flicking nervously to his hands. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and fear. Poirot leaned forward, his expression unwavering. "Because," he said, "I see the letter J written on your hand. And I also see that you have tried to erase it, to remove it from your skin." The man's hand shook slightly as he looked down at his palm, where indeed, faint traces of the letter J were visible. He nodded, as though acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. "You are correct," the man admitted. "I hate that word. It is a reminder of something I would rather forget. A mistake that I cannot undo." For a moment, there was silence at the table. Poirot's gaze was steady, as though he were weighing the man's every word. Just as the man seemed ready to say more, the door of the cafe swung open, and the postman walked in, a letter in his hand. "Excuse me," the postman said, scanning the room. "I've been searching for you, Monsieur Poirot. There is a letter here for you." Poirot raised an eyebrow in curiosity and accepted the letter. He opened it carefully, unfolding the paper inside. His eyes scanned the words quickly, and his expression grew more serious as he read. "Ah," Poirot murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It is from the London police, an inspector requesting my assistance on a special case." Hastings, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, looked at Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "A new case, Poirot? What sort of case?" Poirot folded the letter and looked up at his friend. "It seems the game is afoot, Hastings. There is much more to this than we can yet see." The man who had been sitting at their table seemed to have reached the end of his patience. He stood up abruptly, his face dark with some unspoken emotion. "I must be going," he said, turning quickly and leaving the cafe, his stick tapping loudly against the floor with each step. Poirot and Hastings exchanged a brief look, both of them sensing that this strange encounter was far from over. They gathered their things, preparing to leave for London at once. As Poirot rose from the table, he turned to Hastings. "The case may be far more complicated than we imagine. But one thing is certain, mon ami, it has only just begun." And with that, the two friends walked out into the cold Parisian air, ready to embark on a new adventure that would soon unravel the secrets hidden beneath the surface. Chapter 2: The Unsettling Box. The dull hum of the city outside seemed a far cry from the unsettling atmosphere within the police station. Poirot and Captain Hastings followed the inspector through the sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing off the walls as they made their way to a small, unremarkable room. The inspector, a middle-aged man with a sharp, tired look about him, gestured for them to sit. Poirot's keen eyes scanned the room with a perceptiveness that often escaped the casual observer. After a brief exchange, the inspector led them to the car. "Come, gentlemen, there's something I need to show you," he said with urgency in his tone. The trio piled into the car, and Poirot silently observed the inspector's nervousness as they navigated the streets. Captain Hastings, on the other hand, seemed to relish the action, excited by the prospect of a new mystery unfolding before them. After a short drive, they arrived at a modest house on the edge of the city. The building was simple, unassuming, with two separate sections that appeared to be two flats divided for rent. The inspector motioned toward the entrance. "This is where it all began," he said grimly. They entered the house, and Poirot immediately noted the contrast between the outside simplicity and the palpable tension inside. The woman who greeted them was in her 40s, with a composed yet distressed air about her. Her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and defiance, and her thin lips were set in a firm line. She led them into the living room where a wooden table stood at the center of the room. On the table was a box, simple in design, but its contents were far from ordinary. The woman, with a slight tremor in her voice, spoke up, "Inspector, look at this box on the table." She gestured toward the strange item. The box was small, perhaps no larger than a bread box, but it was the contents inside that caught Poirot's attention immediately. Two human ears were affixed to the top of the box, and inside there was a layer of salt. Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting from the box to the woman. He studied her carefully, as though trying to understand what she was thinking. The woman explained, her voice tinged with both fear and frustration. This box came to me after I evicted the 3 medical students who were renting the upper portion of my house. They hadn't been paying their rent for months, and after many warnings, I had no choice but to ask them to leave. But this is how they're retaliating. They are threatening me in this way, and I don't know what to do. Poirot's sharp mind immediately began to weave together the strands of the situation. He could see the woman was genuinely distressed, but there was also an undercurrent of something else, something deeper, perhaps, in her pride. She had evicted the tenants, yes, but something about her demeanor suggested that she wasn't easily frightened. They must have some reason for doing this, the woman continued. But I won't give in to their threats. I'm not afraid of them. But I don't know how to make them stop. The inspector, who had been standing off to the side, his arms crossed in contemplation, spoke up at last. This must surely be the work of those 3 boys. They are from the medical field, and finding ears for them, that wouldn't be difficult. In fact, it may even be a sick game to them. They might be trying to intimidate you, perhaps even to get revenge for their eviction. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his sharp eyes still focused on the box. His mind was already working through various scenarios, analyzing the woman's words and the unusual contents of the box. The symbolism of the ears was not lost on him. It was a grotesque and disturbing message, one that would certainly unsettle anyone who received it. "Tell me, madam," Poirot began, his voice steady yet inquisitive, "how long had you been renting the upper portion of your house to these students? Were there any signs of trouble before you asked them to leave?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering as if she were deciding how much to reveal. "At first, they were good tenants," she said slowly. "Polite, respectful, but over time, they became more and more difficult. They stopped paying rent on time, and when I confronted them about it, they became defensive. They always had some excuse, but it never made sense. Eventually, I had enough. Poirot nodded, as if he had expected as much. "And you say you are not afraid of them?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her. "But what of the salt inside the box? Why would they include that? Is there any meaning you can think of, something they might be trying to tell you?" The woman looked down at the box, then back at Poirot. "Salt? I don't know. It's just odd. It's not something I've ever seen in a threat like this before. It makes no sense to me." Poirot turned his attention back to the inspector, who had been listening intently. "You are correct, Inspector," Poirot said thoughtfully. "These boys, trained in medicine, may have the knowledge to procure such items. But what they seek, I believe, is not just revenge, it is something more sinister. This box is meant to provoke, to manipulate, to instill fear. The ears, the salt, it is all part of a message, but one that is not immediately clear." The inspector, although seasoned in his own right, appeared perplexed. "What do you suggest, Poirot? How do we stop this?" Poirot smiled faintly, a gleam of understanding in his eyes. "Patience, mon ami, patience. This is not the time for hasty conclusions. We must first understand why these three students would go to such lengths and what they are trying to communicate through these actions." The woman, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of confusion and awe, spoke again. "But what do you mean? Why go through all this trouble? Why the ears? What could they possibly want from me?" Poirot turned his full attention back to her. "That, madam, is what we will uncover. You see, every clue, no matter how strange, has a purpose. And once we understand the purpose, we will be one step closer to unraveling this mystery." Hastings, who had been mostly quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Poirot, are you suggesting that we take a break now? Perhaps gather some more information first? Maybe even have lunch?" Poirot's eyes sparkled with his usual brand of quiet amusement. "Indeed, Hastings. I have worked tirelessly this morning, and I believe a break is in order. 2 hours, no more. After that, we shall continue our investigation." With that, the trio left the house and made their way to a nearby restaurant. The air outside felt colder now, the weight of the case heavy on Poirot's shoulders. As they sat down to lunch, Poirot's mind continued to churn, piecing together the puzzle with each passing moment. His thoughts lingered on the box, the ears, and the salt, symbols of something deeply unsettling. "We will return to the house later," Poirot mused, his voice steady. "But first, we must allow the details to reveal themselves. In time, the truth will emerge." And so, as they sat in the warm glow of the restaurant, Poirot, Hastings, and the inspector took their break, though the investigation had only just begun, and already it was clear that this case would take them down a dark, twisted path. Chapter 3: Unveiling Secrets. The minutes passed in a quiet tension, and Poirot, Hastings, and the inspector returned to the woman's house 2 hours after their brief respite at the restaurant. The inspector, although eager to move forward, kept his eyes on Poirot. The latter was, as always, calm and observant, his sharp gaze taking in every detail of the surroundings as he walked through the house. Poirot's mind was already at work, gathering information from the slightest movement, the faintest change in the air. The house, while unassuming on the outside, had a certain air of unease. The walls were lined with old furniture and framed photographs that spoke of a long history, a family deeply rooted in its past. Poirot's eyes fell upon a large photograph hanging prominently on the wall. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied it closely. "Madam," Poirot began, his voice steady yet inquisitive, "how many sisters do you have?" The woman, who had been watching him closely, shifted her stance slightly. Her lips pressed together as if deciding whether to share this part of her life with the detective. She finally answered, her voice firm yet betraying a hint of reluctance. "We are 3 sisters." Poirot's gaze moved to the photograph again. It featured a group of 3 women, the first one in the middle smiling brightly, the second standing beside her with an elegant grace, and the third, who seemed more reserved, was positioned slightly further back. Poirot's sharp eyes caught the smallest of details. There was something familiar about the pose, the setting. It was almost as if this picture, taken years ago, held secrets waiting to be uncovered. He pointed to the woman in the photograph standing beside the central figure. "Is the girl in this picture your sister?" The woman's eyes flickered briefly before she nodded. "Yes, that is my sister." "And the man standing next to her, he is her friend, a Navy officer." Poirot's eyebrows raised ever so slightly. A Navy officer, indeed, a detail that seemed to ring a bell. "And where is your sister from this picture now?" Poirot asked, his tone light, almost casual, but beneath it lay the quiet intensity of a man accustomed to reading between the lines. The woman hesitated for a moment, her lips tightening before she replied, "She is married now. And coincidentally, her husband is also a Navy officer." Poirot listened intently, his mind working as he processed this new information. The connection between the 2 Navy officers seemed too neat, too convenient. But Poirot never believed in coincidences, not when it came to solving cases. "And what of the third sister?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but insistent. The woman seemed to stiffen at the question. She glanced at the photograph again, then back at Poirot. "The youngest sister is also married," she said with a quiet frustration creeping into her voice. "And both of my sisters are married in different cities. Now, is there anything else you need to know?" Poirot's gaze never left her. He had been studying her closely, noting the subtle changes in her expression, the tension in her voice, and the way her hands, though still, betrayed a slight nervousness. He had the distinct impression that she was hiding something, but what? And how did her sisters fit into all of this? His question seemed to be bothering her, and she crossed her arms tightly. "Why are you asking all these questions?" she demanded, a frown creasing her brow. "I've already told you to catch those 3 medical students. What do my sisters have to do with this?" Poirot paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence. The woman's frustration hung in the air, thick and palpable. Poirot took a step closer, his sharp eyes still studying her face. He could tell she was growing defensive, but he knew that this was no time to let her off the hook. She was hiding something, and Poirot would not leave until he uncovered it. "Madam," Poirot said softly, "I am simply seeking to understand the full picture. All of these pieces, your sisters, the photograph, the Navy officers, are connected somehow, but how? What is the true significance of these details in relation to the events unfolding here?" For a moment, the woman said nothing. She simply stared at him, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust him with more information. Poirot's expression remained steady, never wavering. Finally, after a long pause, she let out a deep sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly in resignation. "You're right," she said, her voice soft but filled with bitterness. "You want to understand everything, don't you? Very well. I'll tell you, but you have to promise me you will focus on the medical students, not my family. This is not their issue." Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving her. "I promise, madam." She seemed to struggle with her words, as if unsure how much to reveal. After a moment, she spoke again. "My sisters and I have always been close, but after their marriages, things changed. My youngest sister, for instance, her husband, a Navy officer, never really fit in with the rest of us. And the man in the photograph, the Navy officer who is my sister's friend, well, he has been around for years. He and my sister had something, but it ended long ago." Poirot raised his hand gently, signaling her to slow down. "Something ended? What exactly are you saying, madam?" She looked down at the floor, her face flushed with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "My sister and the Navy officer, they were once in love. But he was never serious about her, and when she married the other Navy officer, he disappeared from her life. Or so we thought." Hastings, who had been listening quietly, exchanged a glance with Poirot. It seemed that the mystery was taking a different turn, one that could unravel deeper secrets hidden beneath the surface. Poirot, ever the patient detective, allowed the woman to finish her story. "And what does this have to do with the medical students?" Poirot asked, the question hanging in the air like a thread ready to be pulled. The woman looked up at Poirot, her eyes dark with emotion. "I don't know how it connects yet. But my sisters, especially the one in the picture, have been getting strange letters from that Navy officer. He's been following them, and I'm sure he has something to do with this. I don't know how, but I'm convinced he's involved." Poirot's mind raced. The Navy officer, the photograph, the letters, it was all coming together in a way that only he could fully understand. There were too many connections, too many unanswered questions. But what was the link between the Navy officers, the medical students, and the grotesque box with the ears? Poirot turned to the inspector, his voice calm but filled with quiet resolve. "Inspector, take the box and let's head to the police station. I believe we are now on the right track, but we need more information. The medical students, the Navy officers, and the events surrounding this house are all part of a larger scheme, one that we must unravel before it's too late." With that, the detective, the inspector, and Hastings left the house, the weight of the case growing heavier with each step. The mystery had only deepened, and Poirot knew that only by following the threads of truth would he be able to bring the answers to light. The game was afoot, and the true nature of the case was only beginning to reveal itself. Chapter 4: The Sisters' Secrets. The cold, sterile air of the police station hummed with the usual tension, as Poirot, Hastings, and the inspector gathered around a large table cluttered with case files and evidence. The inspector, who had been looking forward to a straightforward resolution, looked at Poirot with a slightly furrowed brow. They had just examined the bizarre box with the ears, and he was certain that the 3 medical students were the culprits. They had no other leads. "It's a simple case," the inspector said, his voice betraying a mix of confidence and frustration. "These 3 students are our prime suspects. We'll catch them. No one else would go to such extremes." Poirot, however, remained calm, his fingers steepled in front of him. He looked the inspector in the eye and shook his head slightly. "Inspector, arresting them would be a mistake." The inspector raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "What do you mean?" "We have them cornered. They're medical students, they must have done this." Poirot's gaze turned to the box, which sat on the table, still a grim reminder of the mystery they were trying to solve. "Ah, the box, and the salt inside. You believe the students would use salt for something like this?" Poirot's voice was soft, but it carried an undeniable authority. "Salt is an easy substance to come by, yes, but it is not the choice of a criminal mastermind, not in a case like this. You see, if the medical students had been the perpetrators, they would have chosen something less obvious, something far more professional. Salt is too mundane, too common. This, my dear inspector, is not the work of amateurs." The inspector stood still for a moment, considering Poirot's words, but the skepticism remained on his face. But the blood on the box, Poirot. It could be from the students. Poirot interrupted him gently, his eyes narrowing as he regarded the box once more. That blood, my friend, was applied with the precision of a professional. This was not done haphazardly, nor by inexperienced hands. The way the blood is splattered, the way it covers the box, this is the work of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Poirot paused and then added, these three students may be troublemakers, but they are not the architects of this crime. The blood, the box, the ears, everything points to a different culprit, one who is much more adept at leaving little evidence behind. Hastings, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. But Poirot, how can you be so sure? What makes you so certain about this? Poirot turned his attention to the two ears on the box. He leaned in closer, studying them with his usual meticulous precision. The ears, Hastings. The ears tell the story. The inspector leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Poirot pointed to the ears on the box. One of these ears is smaller than the other. This indicates it is the ear of a woman. Moreover, there is a hole in the ear, a piercing, which is almost always found in a woman's ear. The second ear, however, is larger and darker in color. It looks as though it has been severely sunburned, a result of prolonged exposure to the sun. This ear belongs to a man. The inspector's eyes widened as he processed Poirot's words. But how could you be so sure, Poirot? It's just a couple of ears. How can you tell the difference? Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It is a matter of experience, Inspector. The details tell the story. The size, the shape, the color, these are all clues that indicate the gender of the person to whom these ears belonged. I can tell with certainty that one ear is from a woman and the other from a man. The inspector seemed to be struck by the obviousness of it all. Why didn't we think of that? He muttered to himself, almost embarrassed. Poirot turned his gaze to the inspector and raised an eyebrow. That is precisely why you called me in, Inspector. Sometimes, the smallest details escape us. The inspector cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. So, if the ears belong to two different people, and if the medical students aren't the ones behind this, then who is? Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers still steepled. That, my friend, is exactly what we must discover. But to do that, we must broaden our search. The three students may not be the culprits, but they are still connected to the case in some way, and their involvement must be investigated further. However, I suspect the real culprit is someone much closer to this situation. The inspector, now clearly intrigued, asked, "Closer? How do you mean?" Poirot's gaze flickered momentarily toward the photograph on the wall that had caught his attention earlier. The woman, the one who owns the house. She is hiding something, Inspector. I have observed her closely, and I can tell that she is not being entirely forthright with us. Hastings, who had been following the conversation closely, asked, "So, you suspect her?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, I do. But not in the way you think. She is not the perpetrator, but she knows more than she is letting on. There is something about her family, her sisters, that ties this whole case together. That is why I asked about them. The photograph, the Navy officers, the relationships within her family, these all seem to be important clues that we cannot ignore." The inspector's face contorted in thought. "So, you're saying we need to look into her sisters?" Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Precisely. But first, there is something you must do for me, Inspector." Go to the home of the second sister, the one we saw in the picture earlier. I will go to the house of the youngest sister. We must speak with them both, and we must do so separately. Time is of the essence." The inspector nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Understood, Poirot. I'll go to the second sister's house. You'll take the youngest." Poirot gave a small nod, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Yes. We will gather information from them, but we must be subtle. The answers we seek are hidden beneath layers of deception, and it will take careful questioning to reveal the truth." The inspector stood up, his hand reaching for his coat. "Very well. I'll head to the second sister's house now." Poirot stood as well, his sharp eyes never leaving the inspector. "And remember, Inspector, we must tread carefully. The case is more complicated than it first appeared, and each step we take must be deliberate." With that, the two men parted ways. Poirot turned to Hastings, who had been silently observing the exchange. "Hastings, my friend, we have much work ahead of us. Let us go and see what secrets the youngest sister may be hiding." The two men left the police station, stepping out into the cool evening air. The streets were bustling with life, but Poirot's mind was far away, already unraveling the threads of the case in his head. He knew that the pieces were falling into place, but there was still much more to uncover. The game was far from over, and Poirot would not rest until he had solved the mystery that lay before him. Chapter 5: The Final Clue. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting a pale orange glow across the quiet streets as Poirot and Hastings walked briskly toward the house of the youngest sister. The day had been long, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly but surely beginning to align. But Poirot knew that there was one final thread to pull, a thread that could unravel the truth in its entirety. As they arrived at the house, Poirot took a moment to observe the surroundings. The house, though modest, had an air of quiet dignity. The windows were shut, the garden well kept, yet there was something eerily still about the place. Poirot rang the doorbell, and after a brief wait, the door creaked open. The man who greeted him was in his mid-30s, dressed in a plain shirt and trousers. He looked disheveled, as though he hadn't slept well in days. His face was a mixture of concern and unease, but it was his eyes that caught Poirot's attention. There was something in them, something that did not quite sit right. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice slightly trembling. Poirot nodded politely. "Good evening, monsieur. I am Hercule Poirot, a private detective. I wish to speak with your wife." The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder as though unsure whether he should let Poirot inside. "My wife is not feeling well," he said quickly. "She's resting. She cannot meet you today. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow." Poirot studied him for a moment, his keen eyes missing nothing. There was an odd tension in the air, a nervousness that seemed to radiate from the man. Poirot, however, did not press the matter. "Of course," he said with a polite smile. "I will return tomorrow then, monsieur. But may I leave my card with you, in case your wife feels better and wishes to speak with me sooner?" The man hesitated for a moment before nodding reluctantly. He took the card from Poirot and closed the door without another word. Poirot stood there for a moment, his thoughts racing, before he turned to Hastings. "Something is not right about this, Hastings," Poirot muttered under his breath. "I have a feeling the youngest sister knows more than she is letting on." Hastings nodded, but before he could say anything further, Poirot's attention was drawn back to the police station, where the inspector had just called him. "Poirot, we've run into some troubling news," the inspector's voice crackled over the phone. The second sister has not been seen for the past 3 days, and her Navy officer husband has been absent as well, also for 3 days. We have another lead. 2 dead bodies have been discovered near the lake. 1 male and 1 female. Poirot's mind immediately shifted into detective mode. "I will meet you there shortly," he said, his voice firm and resolute. He turned to Hastings. "We must go to the lake at once, Hastings. The case is moving fast." The journey to the lake was brief, but Poirot's mind was already piecing together the puzzle. He knew the lake well, a serene, quiet spot that was seldom disturbed by visitors. It seemed the perfect place to dispose of something, or someone, without anyone noticing. When they arrived, the inspector was already on site, his team securing the area. Poirot immediately took in the scene. 2 bodies were lying side by side, their heads covered in a white sheet. A sense of grim finality hung in the air as Poirot knelt down beside the bodies, his eyes scanning for any clues that might have been missed. The first thing Poirot noticed was that both bodies were missing an ear. He looked closer. The bodies appeared to have sustained significant head injuries, blunt force trauma that seemed deliberate. There were signs of struggle, but more than that, the manner in which the bodies were placed suggested a certain level of care, or perhaps even familiarity with the area. "Inspector," Poirot called, his voice low but sharp. "Look here." The inspector approached, his eyes following Poirot's gaze to the bloodstains on the boat nearby. There were marks of a struggle there, and more disturbingly, blood spattered on a machete lying nearby. Poirot leaned in even closer, inspecting the marks carefully. "When did the bodies get found?" Poirot asked, his voice steady. "Just a few hours ago," the inspector replied, his brow furrowing in confusion. "We received a report about a suspicious boat near the edge of the lake. When we investigated, we found the bodies inside." Poirot turned to the boat owner, who had been waiting nearby. "Monsieur, can you tell me what happened here 3 days ago?" The man, visibly shaken, nodded. 3 days ago, those 2 people, the man and the woman, came to me and asked to borrow my boat. I didn't think much of it at the time, they seemed like any other couple. I didn't ask where they were going. They just disappeared for the day. I didn't think to question them. Poirot studied the boat owner's face closely. "Did you see anyone else around the lake at the time? Any unusual person?" The boat owner hesitated, his eyes shifting uneasily. "There was a man. He was tall, had brown skin. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that you mention it, I do remember seeing him standing on the shore. He looked out of place." Poirot's mind raced. "And how did you discover the bodies?" "I was out on the lake again today," the owner explained. "I noticed the boat had been moved to the side, almost hidden, as if someone didn't want it to be found. When I got closer, I found them inside. Both of them." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "I see." He turned to the inspector. "The bodies, Inspector. They belong to the second sister and her friend, the Navy officer we saw in the photograph. This is the crucial link we needed." The inspector's eyes widened in realization. "But how can you be so sure, Poirot?" Poirot glanced at the bloodstains on the machete and then back at the boat owner. This was no ordinary murder. The man who killed them knew the lake well and had access to the boat. The body of the woman was placed with the ear missing, just like the box we found. The bloodstains tell the rest of the story. The inspector looked troubled. "So, what now? Should we arrest the husband as soon as he returns from his duty?" Poirot stood up, his face grave. "Yes. As soon as he arrives, arrest him. He is the most likely suspect. But we must be careful. There is more to this than meets the eye. The husband is hiding something. And once he's apprehended, the truth will come out. The bodies were carefully transported to the morgue for a post-mortem. Poirot and Hastings made their way back to the police station, where they would wait for the next developments. As they sat in the quiet of the police station, Poirot leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "Hastings," he said, his voice thoughtful. "This case is nearly finished, but we must remember, every detail, every piece of evidence matters. The real criminal has been hiding in plain sight, and now we are close to unmasking him." Hastings nodded, his brow furrowed. But why would the husband be involved? He seemed so normal. Poirot smiled faintly. "That is the key, Hastings. The more normal someone seems, the more likely they are hiding something. But we will uncover it all soon enough. The final pieces are falling into place." Chapter 6: The Final Revelation. The quiet hum of the police station was broken only by the occasional shuffle of paperwork or the murmur of officers exchanging information. Poirot sat at his usual spot, a quiet air of contemplation about him, his sharp eyes darting occasionally between the pile of evidence before him and the door through which the inspector would soon return. Hastings stood near the window, looking out at the evening sky, his mind no doubt still piecing together the strange events of the day. The case, though progressing, was far from over. It was late when the door swung open and the inspector walked in, his face a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. He had just come from the hospital, having followed up on the latest developments. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the inspector approached the desk where Poirot sat today. He paused for a moment before speaking, his voice tinged with frustration. "Poirot," the inspector began, "how can you be so sure that the ears from the box belong to the two dead bodies? How are you so certain about the murderer? What makes you so confident?" Poirot sat back in his chair, folding his hands in his characteristic way, his gaze never leaving the inspector's face. "Ah, my dear inspector," he said softly, his voice calm yet filled with an air of certainty, "I knew the truth about those ears the moment I stepped foot inside that woman's house. You see, the ears, their shape and size, were identical, as if they belonged to the same family. When I looked at the woman and her photograph of her sisters, I realized that one of those ears must have belonged to her sister." Poirot paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. The inspector looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But how can you be so sure, Poirot?" he asked, clearly struggling to understand the connection. "How can you deduce all of this from a simple photograph?" Poirot smiled slightly, his lips curling into a knowing expression. "It is all in the details, Inspector. The ear on the box was a key to unraveling this case. The moment I saw the photograph of the woman and her sisters, I recognized that the woman's ears and the ear on the box had the same unique features. The shape of the ear, the lobe, the size, everything matched. The connection was simple but crucial." Poirot's voice grew more serious as he continued, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Then, when we visited the youngest sister's house, we learned that she was home. But the second sister, the one from the photograph, was not. This confirmed my suspicion. The dead body we found by the lake was, indeed, the second sister's, and the other body, the male body, belonged to her friend, the Navy officer." The inspector's eyes widened as he processed the information. "But Poirot, how could you know for certain that the bodies were those of the second sister and her friend?" he asked, clearly trying to keep up with the detective's rapid deductions. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his hands still folded neatly in front of him. "It was all about the subtle details," he explained. "First, the boat owner mentioned seeing a man with brown skin, tall and officer-like in stature. It was a description that fit the friend of the second sister perfectly, a Navy officer, no less. And the manner of death, drowned in the lake, only made sense when we considered the victim's connection to the water. After all, only someone with the strength and stamina of a Navy officer could have swum in the lake for such a long period of time and then chased down the boat. The inspector nodded slowly, his mind beginning to understand Poirot's reasoning. "I see," he said quietly. "But what about the blood on the box? How does that fit into the puzzle?" Poirot's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained calm and collected. "Ah, the blood. That was another piece of the puzzle that pointed to a professional. Whoever placed the blood on the box knew what they were doing. This was no amateur. The blood had been applied with precision, indicating experience, perhaps someone from a military or law enforcement background. Navy, police, something like that. It was clear that the killer had a certain level of training or expertise. Hastings, who had been listening intently to the conversation, now stepped forward, his eyes wide with curiosity. "But Poirot," he interjected, "what about the absence of water in the stomachs of the bodies? What does that tell us?" Poirot's gaze shifted to the window for a moment before returning to Hastings. "That is the most crucial detail of all," he said softly. "If the victims had been drowned, there would have been water in their stomachs. But there was none. This tells us that they were killed first, likely with blunt force trauma, as the head injuries suggest, and then, after their deaths, their bodies were dumped in the lake. The head wounds confirmed this theory." The inspector's face was a mixture of amazement and confusion. "So, you're saying that the victims were murdered elsewhere, then brought to the lake and dumped? That explains the lack of water in their stomachs, but why?" Poirot nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Exactly, Inspector. The bodies were disposed of in the lake after they were already dead. And the method of disposal, the blood on the box, the struggle at the lake, all points to the same conclusion: this was no random act. The killer knew exactly what they were doing." The inspector stood silently for a moment, processing Poirot's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm. "Poirot, I must admit, I'm starting to see the picture you've painted. But I still don't understand how you're so sure about the murderer. You're saying it was the Navy officer, aren't you?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet confidence. "Ah, that is where the final piece of the puzzle comes into play, Inspector. The murderer is the Navy officer, without a doubt. The connection between the second sister and the Navy officer, the injuries, the blood, the manner of death, it all fits. I have given you my theory, and now, the rest will be explained by the Navy officer himself. He will reveal everything, I'm sure of it." The inspector looked at Poirot, a mix of admiration and disbelief in his eyes. "So, what's the next step? Do we arrest him?" Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. "Not yet, Inspector. First, we must wait. The Navy officer will soon come to us. He won't be able to hide the truth for long." Later that evening, the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls of the police station as the Navy officer, the suspect in question, was brought in for questioning. Poirot and the inspector stood together, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Hastings stood off to the side, his curiosity palpable, eager to see how this final confrontation would unfold. As the Navy officer entered the room, his demeanor was calm, almost too calm, his face a mask of professionalism. He had clearly been expecting this moment, though he likely hadn't anticipated the speed with which Poirot had pieced everything together. Poirot stood to face him, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Monsieur," he began, his voice quiet but commanding, I believe you have some explaining to do." The Navy officer's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice steady. Poirot smiled slightly. "Ah, but you do. The second sister, your old friend. The body we found by the lake. The blood, the missing ears. Everything points to you." The Navy officer's face went pale, but only for a moment. He quickly recovered, but Poirot had already seen enough. "It's over," Poirot said softly, his tone final. "The truth is inescapable. Your connection to the second sister, your involvement with her, it all led us here. And now, you will tell us everything." The Navy officer's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, his carefully constructed facade cracked. He knew there was no way out. "It wasn't supposed to end this way," he muttered. "But I never meant for it to go this far." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "It doesn't matter now, monsieur. The truth always comes to light, in the end." As the Navy officer was led away, Poirot turned to the inspector and Hastings. "Another case solved," he said quietly. "But remember, gentlemen, it is the small details, the ones we often overlook, that reveal the truth in the end." With that, Poirot and his companions left the police station, knowing that justice had been served, and the mystery had finally been unraveled. Chapter 7: The Heart of Darkness. The clinking of handcuffs was the only sound that broke the otherwise heavy silence as the Navy officer was led into the small interrogation room. His shoulders were slumped, his once proud uniform now a symbol of the man's fall from grace. The quiet murmurs of the officers who stood around him were barely audible, but Poirot, who had been standing in the corner of the room, had heard enough. The truth was about to surface, and it would lay bare the horrors that had been committed beneath the calm exterior of the man before him. Poirot had been waiting for this moment, this confession. He knew that the Navy officer had not been acting on his own desires or motives. There had been external forces at play, forces that Poirot had suspected but had not been able to fully comprehend until now. It was a twisted tale of love, obsession, and manipulation, and now it was time for the man to reveal the full extent of his actions. The officer sat down slowly, his eyes avoiding Poirot's gaze. His face was pale, his hands trembling as they rested on the table in front of him. His eyes darted nervously, and Poirot could see the weight of the confession he was about to make pressing heavily on him. I didn't want it to end this way," the Navy officer began, his voice shaky. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the officer. "But it did happen, monsieur. You killed 2 people. You destroyed lives, and you are responsible for the pain and suffering that followed." The officer looked up at Poirot, his eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I know," he whispered. "But I didn't have a choice. I was forced into it. You have to understand that." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the officer's words. "Forced? Forced by whom?" The officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It was my wife's youngest sister. She didn't care about anyone but herself. She wanted me. She made me feel like I had no choice. She told me that she didn't love her husband anymore, and that she loved me. She said we should be together. She kept telling me to divorce my wife and marry her instead." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his expression both skeptical and intrigued. "And you believed her? You let her manipulate you?" The officer hung his head, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I didn't want to believe her, Poirot. But she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't leave me alone. She would find ways to make me doubt my love for my wife. She even went as far as introducing me to my wife's best friend. She encouraged the affair between them. I tried to stop her. I told her that I loved my wife, but she didn't care. She just kept pushing. Poirot's gaze softened ever so slightly. He had seen this kind of obsession before, the kind of manipulation that preyed on the vulnerability of others. "And your wife, what did she say?" The officer's eyes flickered with sadness, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "She started to suspect something was wrong. She asked me for a divorce. At first, I couldn't understand it. I told her I loved her, that I would never leave her. But the damage had already been done. The youngest sister's game was working. My wife started to believe that I didn't love her anymore." The weight of the officer's words hung heavily in the air. Poirot had heard many confessions in his time, but this one felt different. There was a sense of desperation, of a man losing control over his own life. And yet, that did not absolve him of his actions. One day, the officer continued, his voice growing more strained, "I found out that my wife and her friend were going out together. I followed them. I couldn't let it happen. I knew what they were planning. They were going to meet somewhere, and I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. They boarded a boat, and I swam after them." Poirot's brow furrowed as he listened. "You swam after them? Why?" "I don't know," the officer whispered, his eyes distant. "I couldn't think clearly. I just knew I had to stop them. When I climbed onto the boat, I didn't know what I was going to do. But when I saw my wife's friend sitting there, laughing and so full of life, I just lost it. I killed her. I didn't want to, but I did. And then, when I saw my wife sitting there, crying next to her friend's dead body, I couldn't stop myself. I killed her too." Poirot remained silent for a moment, allowing the officer's confession to sink in. He had heard the words, but the truth was still far too terrible to fully comprehend. The officer had taken 2 lives, driven by jealousy and manipulation, and yet there was something deeper, something more complex, at play here. The officer wasn't simply the villain in this story, he was also the victim of a twisted web of lies and deceit. "You say you didn't want to kill your wife," Poirot finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, "but you did. Why?" The officer's face contorted in anguish. "Because of her. The youngest sister. She had convinced me that my wife didn't love me. She made me believe that everything was falling apart. I was so confused, Poirot. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I just wanted it all to stop." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind working furiously to process the information. "And the ears, monsieur?" "The ears you cut off and sent to the youngest sister in a parcel." The officer shuddered, his face pale. "That was... I don't know. I thought it would show her what kind of game she was playing. I thought it would make her understand the consequences of her actions. She had been toying with me, manipulating me, and I wanted her to know what she had caused." Poirot's gaze hardened slightly. "You sought to punish her for the manipulation, but in doing so, you created a cycle of violence that you cannot undo." The officer's eyes welled up with tears as he nodded slowly. "I know, Poirot. I know." Poirot sat back in his chair, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "The youngest sister, monsieur, she is not blameless in this. But that does not excuse your actions. You killed 2 people, and for that, you will face the consequences." The officer's voice cracked as he whispered, "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to kill anyone." Poirot stood up, his demeanor firm but compassionate. "That may be true, monsieur. But your actions have brought irreversible damage. It is time for you to face the truth of what you have done." As the officers led the Navy officer away, Poirot turned to the inspector, his face thoughtful. "The truth is always painful, Inspector," he said quietly. "But it must come out, no matter the cost. The youngest sister may have manipulated the officer, but he, too, was responsible for his actions. The webs we weave, even with the best of intentions, can trap us in ways we never imagined." The inspector nodded, his face grim. "And what happens now?" Poirot paused, his eyes meeting the inspector's. "Now, the legal system must take its course. The youngest sister may also need to answer for her part in this. But the real tragedy is that both sisters, in their own ways, lost the love and respect of the man who once loved them. It is a tragic story, one where everyone involved suffered." As the officer was taken away, Poirot and Hastings walked slowly back to the station. The case was over, but the haunting memories of the events that had unfolded would stay with them. The complexities of human nature, the twisted emotions that drove men and women to commit unspeakable acts, this was the heart of every mystery, and Poirot knew that, in the end, the truth always came to light, no matter how dark it seemed. Epilogue: The Aftermath. The sun had long set by the time Poirot and Hastings left the police station, the cool evening air brushing against their faces as they walked silently down the quiet streets of the city. The mystery that had consumed them for days was now resolved, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The Navy officer, once a man of honor and discipline, now sat in a cold, dimly lit cell. His confession had been sincere, yet it did little to erase the damage he had wrought. 2 lives had been lost, his wife and her friend, and the web of manipulation spun by the youngest sister had brought tragedy in its wake. Yet, despite the officer's remorse, the law was clear. He would face trial, and the consequences of his actions would be inevitable. Poirot's mind, always working, lingered on the deeper aspects of the case. The youngest sister, though not the direct murderer, had played a pivotal role in the destruction of lives. Her manipulation, her selfishness, her refusal to let go of a love that had never truly been hers, these were the driving forces behind the tragedy. Yet, in Poirot's heart, there was a quiet sadness. There were no true victors in this story. At the police station, the inspector had already begun preparing his report. The bodies of the 2 victims had been returned to their families, but no amount of paperwork or legal procedures could undo the scars left by the crime. The youngest sister, though not immediately arrested, would likely be called to testify. Her role in the tragedy would be investigated further, but Poirot knew that no punishment could truly heal the wounds inflicted by her actions. As Poirot and Hastings walked through the streets, Hastings glanced at his friend, who seemed lost in thought. "You seem troubled, Poirot," he said, his voice filled with quiet concern. "I know this case was complicated. But the officer has confessed. The truth has come to light." Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yes, Hastings. The truth always comes to light, eventually. But there is a certain sadness in it. The officer, despite his terrible actions, was a victim in some ways. A man torn apart by manipulation, by love, by obsession. He should have known better, but he didn't. And in the end, it destroyed him, destroyed everyone involved." Hastings remained silent for a moment, thinking deeply about Poirot's words. "But what about the youngest sister?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "She's not blameless either, is she?" Poirot's expression softened, and he sighed. "No, Hastings. She is not blameless. but she, too, was a victim of her own desires. Her inability to see the consequences of her actions, her selfishness, it led to the destruction of everything she once held dear. The tragedy here is that all three of them, the officer, the wife, and the youngest sister, lost the one thing that mattered most: love, trust, and respect for one another. In the end, that is what was truly lost. The two men walked in silence for a few more moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The city around them hummed with life, the streets busy with pedestrians and vehicles, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded just hours before. Poirot's mind, ever sharp and analytical, shifted to the next mystery. What awaited him next? What new puzzle would present itself? But for now, he took solace in knowing that the truth had been uncovered, no matter how painful it was for all involved. In the distance, the lights of the police station flickered on, a reminder that justice had been served, but the scars of the past would remain. As Poirot and Hastings continued their walk through the streets, the sense of closure was bittersweet. The case was over, but the complexities of the human heart and the consequences of one's actions would never cease to haunt them both.